Why is shame such a powerful emotion? How does it affect us mentally, physically, emotionally? I'm Nadia Davis. I'm a mom, author, attorney, and Kundalini yoga teacher who has experienced public shaming that brought me to my knees. On this podcast, I'm going to tell you how I'm living the work taking shame out of the shadows. I'll give you real life advice and skills to take away with you throughout your day. You'll hear from powerful guests who have overcome trauma and emerged stronger than ever. You too can ban the shame within and around you. Join me. You are not alone. Hi, everyone. Nadia here with a very, very special guest, Nancy O'Malley, whom was the former district attorney in Alameda County and so many other things. I can't wait to share with you. This is going to be one of the most difficult and freeing conversations and informative. She wrote the preface in my book, Home is Within You, a memoir of recovery and redemption for an extremely important and personal reason. The book is so much so a statement how we all deserve a safe place to share, cry, and be vulnerable. And often it seems we can't find that outside ourselves, especially if you are a trauma survivor, you're in the midst of something very painful and confusing. You're finding it difficult to accept you may be a quote unquote victim. You are. There is a place within you where we have to start. And I call it home. I call it a home, what a home should feel like. And when we create that space within, we are able to connect to our truth and slowly begin protecting ourselves and a healing journey. So today's conversation is going to be kind personal. A lot of stuff will be coming up, and most importantly, some great legal history and technical history, all through the leadership and amazing trailblazing work of Nancy O'Malley. I'm going to do my best to be bold and speak on behalf of all survivors of interpersonal fraud, narcissistic abuse disorder, dyadic abusive relationships. There's so many different names to it that I now know. Yet when you're in the midst of it, there are so many layers and it is so confusing and painful. And when our responses to that pain and abuse are shamed, it gets even more difficult. So I stand here to acknowledge your truth because I was able to finally find a place to acknowledge my own. And the solution in the big picture scheme of everything is Nancy O'Malley's leadership. It really is understanding the internal survivor's reality, the perpetrators, abusers, what you feel comfortable with, the psychological tactics, and balancing that with more trauma-informed investigations, community responses, and justice implementation. She is really the one that has brought in that perspective, that leadership across the nation. She is recently retired Alameda County District Attorney. She joined the office in 1984. In 1999, this is very cool, she was named the first woman to serve as chief assistant, and in 2009 became the first woman to serve as district attorney in Alameda County, an office that was once led by Earl Warren. How cool is that? Now, I can't over exaggerate Nancy O'Malley's national and statewide leadership for her innovative and trailblazing vision. Her career has made combating violence against women and children one of the highest priorities nationwide. She has handled thousands of cases involving interpersonal violence and exploitation, from being a trial attorney in Alameda County to leading drafting and passage of legislation. When I myself found myself in the trenches of psychological terror that was very, very difficult to understand, all of this is in the book. I did not know how to get out and prevent myself from what ultimately became a violent physical assault. The public shaming after and the judgment of the relationship, as well as my behaviors after, were so deeply painful. And it took a decade to really free myself from little less than a decade. It was a 7-year journey to free myself from all the outside name calling and let alone begin on my own shame within. Nancy O'Malley told me recently at a book event up north that my case led to new legislation and strangulation law investigations. And I was blown away because I was merely trying to get out and survive and heal during all of that, and was told by therapists to not have any contact or look at anything online and everything of the sort. But here was Nancy O'Malley the entire time with insight and compassion into a survivor's reality, knowing the power of facts and truth. And so when she told me this, I said, please come to on this podcast. I want to know about that law and that, but I also want to know how she began, how she got involved initially in all of this and got to this place today where she is truly changing victims' rights and accountability for perpetrators, and just a real, true, authentic perspective in the justice system that is really, truly helping others. So I hope that that explains why this is both deeply personal and legally technical in a very informative way. So, Nancy, thank you, first of all, so much for believing in me when I was hired to lead the Family Justice Center in Alameda County, but also just being the incredible, incredible leader that you are. How did that all start? Where was that little part of you as a little girl that always knew that you were meant to do this?
Well, thank you, Nadia, for just such a beautiful introduction. And I will say that I'm inspired by you every time I hear you speak about life, about your experience, about this very important issue that is opening doors for so many other people who are going through similar situations. It's inspiring, and it's your selflessness about being able to share your experience. It's not so much the details of it, it's the how it has impacted you emotionally and intellectually. And
Oh,
it's
wow.
takes a lot of courage to once again put yourself in the limelight, because I do remember the type of or the experiences that you had after you were separated away from a very violent person, and you withstood it. You are a giant in terms of your interpersonal strength and your self awareness. So I'm so honored to be here with you and to call you my dear friend. Um,
Thank you,
so,
Nancy.
how I first got involved, I have to go back to my childhood. So, my parents had nine
Mm.
kids. My dad was always kind of an activist. My mother was everybody's mother. And, we always said that even though they had eight kids, ultimately, one of my sisters died many years before, that there was always room for somebody who needed a place. That was my mother. She never judged why people needed to come and stay with us. She just set an extra plate at the table or, put blankets on the couch or whatever. So my mother taught me about caring for others and using the strength that I had, inner strength, to be strong for others. My dad was when I was in younger. My dad was the district attorney of Contra Costa County, and I remember at dinner one night, we're all sitting around, and he said to me, "What are you doing? What are you doing with yourself now, like to help other people?" And I said, "What do you mean? What am I doing? I'm like a teenager. What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, I've just funded a new program, and it's called a program for victims of domestic violence." And it was Battered
Wow.
Woman's Alternative was the name of the program. He said, "They need volunteers. So what are you doing?" And I said, "I don't
Oh.
know. I guess I'll go volunteer."
Mhm.
And that's how really got exposed to
As
this
a teenager.
this horrible phenomenon that occurs in our community um, at a very early age. It was back in the 70s. I think it was 74. And he was also the first district attorney to ever fund a program that
Wow.
helped victims that directly and that uniquely. Uh,
So we're talking my age, I mean, 50s, 50, 55 years ago.
yeah, when you say
That
it like
was the
that, I feel
level of
very old.
services.
Yeah,
Well, that's, I'm
yeah,
52. So it's like,
exactly.
when I was born, what was it like then?
It was horrible. So, what I would witness is that most of the victims that would actually call the police were so severely abused. It took sometimes years for them to be able to have the courage to call for help. While
And
the
that
abuse went on for years, it was only when it became so harmful, and I don't mean psychologically harmful, that happens the first time, but physically harmful that they had to call the police. Battered Woman's Alternative, and it was one of the first domestic violence shelters. Um, when I was volunteering, I was listening to women tell their stories about how long they had been suffering abuse. And what they
right,
told us at that time, which was not uncommon, and this is not a current criticism of law enforcement. This is a criticism of law enforcement being kind of the last ones at the table. But police would come and they would walk the batterer around the block and say, "Cool down,
right,
just stop doing it, just calm down." And that little walk was supposed to end it all. And then they would tell the victim, sometimes more times than I can recount, "If you just make sure that you don't do anything to upset him, then
precisely.
you won't be hit." Wow, that was so blaming and so like you're
Shaming.
responsible for your own abuse, which it was horrid. So that was a lot
And
of
it
the
was
advocacy.
reaffirming the tactics used by what word
Exactly.
are you comfortable with? Abusers, perpetrators? What word are you comfortable with using in this conversation?
I use them intertwined because,
Okay.
yeah,
And that is what happens. And so it was reaffirming this blaming strategy when they would say that to the survivors, which happened to me. So
exactly.
then, okay, so what else was it like then?
So, for women, and it was all women in those days. Men, while they may have been being abused, it was a small percentage. Um, but so what we started seeing was, now I'm going to fast forward a little bit, because
Mhm.
even when I then went to law school and then went into the DA's office, it was still the same behaviors
Mhm.
that people were being, the crime was discounted. It was pushed at the bottom of the pile of violent crime. It was considered a family matter. Um,
The
and
psychological, emotional abuse, even all of
exactly,
that was overridden even prior to the physical,
that's
and then
right.
the physical, it had to get extreme.
Right. And the
Okay.
other part that was really horrid was that there weren't very many resources. There weren't very many shelters for women
Right.
to go to. But that was a tough decision for a woman with children to leave her home and go live in a shelter. And but what was really difficult was that, as if the police were called and the abuser was arrested, then all what we saw more often than not was he would call, he'd cry, I didn't mean to, it won't happen again. And of course, this is someone that she at one point loved, and now the emotional involvement with the abuser was so complicated that he
Right.
would just cry or beg forgiveness, it'll never happen again, and then she would have him come back. The other complicated thing was that many of the women were stay-home mothers, so
Right.
that they relied on the abuser for their existence.
Right.
And nobody at that time ever understood the impact on children who
Mhm.
witness violence, or the transfer of violence to the children. It was so horribly complicated, and there
To
was
get
nothing
into the
that was being done.
psychological mind and help a survivor understand what web they've been put in
That's right.
is very difficult because of all the psychological and emotional um, tactics that are used before. And it wasn't until recently that I learned about like the narcissistic personality disorder. And I hate labels, but you can't get there until the survivor themselves, until I myself was able to go within and know my worth and connect with the truth. But when things started changing, did things when things started changing with services, how what was your what did you witness during that time?
Well, first of all, the state of California started funding domestic violence programs. And right now, the state of California still has an advisory board, the Domestic Violence Advisory Committee, and I chair that committee. I don't chair it.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I am the sergeant at arms, because I'm got
Okay.
to keep the rules. Um, but I've been on that committee for many years, and we're still as active now about making sure that the way in which the law is and services are provided is appropriate to the survivor.
Okay.
So,
What do you how would you then call what is appropriate? How is like trauma informed? That's a loaded question.
mhm. Well,
Trauma, yes.
first, that there's in police academies, there are classes on domestic violence, and um, one of the so we need trained police officers to understand. But a lot of times, the way in which we change a norm in is by changing the law. And so there's been a tremendous amount of laws that are passed
Mhm.
that recognize domestic violence, that recognize the trauma, that incorporate in action that is required to be taken by law enforcement.
So
And
that's been under your leadership, this wave of integrating survivor informed delivery
that's right.
services and investigations, but that took decades, and there's still so much to do. But you're is that what you're saying, that the law, and then it's been slowly resulting in a change?
Right. It's the law for sure, but the law is only as good as the enforcer. And
Mhm.
so, I one of the really strong lessons I learned many years ago. I was sitting in Sacramento, waiting to testify on a bill that I was sponsoring,
Mhm.
and I was sitting next to a very elegant older woman, and she sat all day. I mean, it was crazy. We were there for 12 hours or something before they even got around to calling a bill on domestic violence. And so we started talking, and she told me that her husband was a very well-known physician in Sacramento area, and that he had been abusing her for years. And she never
Mm.
told anyone because her husband was prominent. They were a prominent family. And that she finally, when she read about this bill that was going to be heard, she had to come and hear what they had to say to make sure that they were recognizing not just, they recognized everyone who's vulnerable to being a victim of domestic violence, and not just a stereotype that law enforcement or society had in mind.
Right.
And that was really
That was
telling to me because we can't judge. We could
Mhm.
not write a law that protected one group and left out the other because of our
Everyone.
perception of who is
Right.
committing the crime and who is a victim of the crime.
That's fascinating, and it's a survival tactic to present as though
Mhm.
everything is okay, like the officer saying, "Well, just don't do anything." Well, it's yes, so many layers, so many layers. Um, so the laws began to change under
Right.
your leadership, and Nancy O'Malley led so many different pieces of legislation to do that, including the development of the Family Justice Center network and the development of co-located collaborative services for victims, so that when what we used to call when they enter a port of entry, the service doesn't end at the ER, the police department, or on the bus. That survivors are linked to all the different services that they can get. Getting back to more trauma or survivor perspective laws, um, name the few that were the most critically helpful. So it was the law enforcement training that wasn't required before.
It was not, no, it wasn't required.
Okay. And then what and then how about, questioning of survivors? Nancy led the establishment of places where survivors could be interviewed, particularly children, in a place where they felt, a little safer, a little where it wasn't as daunting of an experience. But again, all of these perspectives, all of these ideas don't evolve, don't come unless, like, as a society, we're starting to think differently. We're starting to say, what is really going on in that person? Let me take a deeper look beyond what is just on the surface. So I wanted to ask you, before we get into the strangulation law, how does like public shaming and or media skew the seeking of the facts in a case, um, and or yeah, the public perception, how does that make it more difficult from a prosecutor's, from a district attorney's perspective? And then that leads into the importance of the physical evidence and why it's so important, and that led to these other laws. What is your perspective on
The media has an important role to play, not in revealing the number of incidents that occur, but rather giving focus to, in a heartful, compassionate way, giving focus to the impact of domestic violence on victim survivors and their children. That's one area in which the media really has a golden opportunity. What I
Right.
think is that in some respects, the media is selling newspapers. They want people to read their editions. And so they can sensationalize or give focus to something that is salacious or something that is, you know, gossipy in order to get people to read about it. And, sadly, in our society, people like to read the magazines that talk about somebody's trauma or talk about somebody's sadness or their unfortunate situation. And so I think that the media, responsible media, reports appropriately, but then there are all sorts of ways in which the way it's written, victims get blamed. The way it's written is very insensitive to and doesn't really dig into the causes of domestic violence. It just tells a story that is can come out salacious. You know,
I see.
people
Yeah.
people or media was
Doesn't get to
reporting
the
about.
truth of the matter nor public awareness and where it can be used
Right.
for
And some
information.
are very responsible about that. Like
Mhm.
October is Domestic Violence
Right.
Awareness Month. I will say that every year I started this in 1990. Hillary Larkin and I started the domestic homicide. We called it our Day of Remembrance, and we honored individuals that have been killed as a result of
Mhm.
domestic violence since 1991. And every year we would just add to the list, and then we would have a public event, beginning people you couldn't even find a seat. But media never showed up to hear the stories from families who lost a loved one.
It's so
And this is a
interesting
great
because
opportunity
yeah,
to bring that kind of
yes.
public awareness. And the more the media or the more the public talks about it, the more people can feel like I'm not an outlier. This is
Right.
happening on my
And not
block.
have shame about
Exactly.
recognizing it within themselves that something painful is happening here. I need to reach out for help.
Right.
Right.
And I don't have to be embarrassed. I don't have to feel like people are going to judge me. That
Mhm.
that has been a huge, huge um, advancement in the advocacy world. And there are pioneers that have, like Better Women's Alternative is not called that anymore, but it's still
Right.
around.
It's
And
so interesting. I was interviewing Dr. Donna Blevin and a therapist, renowned in her work, and she was explaining the same thing was happening in a ton of national research on depression and suicidality and other things, and in the diagnostic book, the changes that were being proposed, they found a pattern of childhood trauma in depression, addiction, suicidality. And this is an historical fact that relates to this. And all of a sudden, those numbers, those findings of significant source being childhood trauma, um, were just ignored and just set aside. And just like with the events you're talking about today, the numbers that are having media stories that educate, that try and cover the victims, the survivors' perspective and experience so that others can recognize it. Why it's so interesting. Why is that public shame there? And the media has a golden opportunity, like you said, to humanize the experience and to have those. It's not just telling the story, it's talking about the human experience and getting, to the beef and the real life issues. And so, yeah.
well, part of the challenge for the media is most of their stories are 2 minutes, right?
Right.
So you can't tell this in 2 minutes. You can spotlight somebody, and that public
Sure.
shaming, inadvertent, I believe. I truly do believe that they're not trying to do that. But it would be, but we don't see anymore any kind of a documentary about this, like the strangulation law. It would be great to have a documentary on what that is and how California was leading the nation in addressing strangulation. And I have to say that
Uh,
the
Yes,
people that are really at the heart of the law
documentary is
and
right. Oh,
heart
okay.
of training is Casey Gwynn and
Mhm.
Gail Strack. In fact,
Yes.
they started a strangulation clinic that is exceptional. They have
Mhm.
police officers being trained. They have survivors. They have advocates. They have legislators so that
There
people
is
can
so
actually
much
understand.
amazing groundwork and changes happening, so much. So those should be the stories. So
Exactly.
let's get into that. Um, yes, the Family Justice Center Network, and okay, they are speaking out and they are getting attention, and as well, it should the information that they're trying to spread should be getting out. So say more, please.
So before we started hearing more and more, not documented in police reports or in medical records necessarily. And by medical records, I mean there's an actual form that the state of California requires the medical provider to
Mhm.
complete um,
Okay.
for sexual assault, domestic violence, child abuse, things like that.
The
We
medical provider, it may be a doctor or an emergency room.
That's right. That's
Okay.
right. And I mean, the law says that they have to complete that form when somebody makes a report. And they also have to report it to the police, which I support. I know there's been, and again, there will be another bill introduced to try to eliminate mandatory reporting by healthcare providers to law enforcement about domestic violence.
Mhm.
My personal feeling is the survivor is never required to engage with law enforcement, but if
Mhm.
we don't know what's going on behind closed doors, it will continue.
Right.
And so I support that the
The
requirement of
mandatory reporting of a
mandatory
medical
reporting.
provider, and that is one of those ports of entries. And so,
That's right.
okay.
So
So
so the medical provider, for years, nobody ever asked about strangulation. They never asked, not they, and they wouldn't. You don't even have to call it strangulation. How about, did
physical
the
assault.
perpetrator put his hands? I'm going to use he, but I know women can be perpetrators too. Did he put his hands on your throat? Ask that question. But it was not part of the protocol, and nobody thought about it. Then, and I remember one situation where I got a call and talking about, this had strangled her, and I said, tell the doctor to scope your throat. Just put a
Mhm.
scope down there to see the trauma in your
So
throat. Because,
explain that well, we're gonna get into explaining the scope, correct? Okay, so
yes,
now
yes,
and the doctor, did they?
no, because doctors didn't know about it. Nobody thought about the internal injuries unless it was obvious. And so, we've refined that quite a bit, hugely. Um, and so, but even still, the law defined what domestic violence is. But what it didn't include was strangulation or putting your hands on someone's throat and restricting their ability to breathe. So the first year that the bill came forward, a lot of us testified on the bill, supported the bill. It didn't get out of the legislature the first year.
When was this?
I was trying to remember back. It wasn't as long as you think it would be. This was
Mhm.
in the teens, so probably 17 or 8, 2017, 18, 19 maybe. But we came back the next year, and it's again, this was sponsored by, I think, by Casey Gwynn and Gail Strack and the network. But we came back, and there was a lot of education given to the legislators about, the impact. I mean, you think about it, and this is how I would talk about it. when the law outlawed law enforcement from doing chokeholds on someone, which was literally put your hands around their throat till they pass out. That's what strangulation could be, the same physiologic impact. So when we started linking it to other areas where the legislature had outlawed the use of these chokeholds or things, it started to make more sense. And having more and more survivors speak out about the abuse that oftentimes included putting their hand around the throat and restricting the breathing. And, again, bruising doesn't show up for a couple of days. And so the very courageous victim that goes to the emergency room or is taken to the emergency room who says, this is what, the hand was on my throat, that's where the doctors were missing a huge amount of evidence of abuse and trauma. And so the law changed to say that not only do the doctors have to ask about strangulation, but it has outlawed and it has made it an enhancement, an addition to the charges that there was strangulation involved in this domestic violence. It's documented, and shockingly, well, maybe it's not so shocking to those of us in this world, but that all of a sudden we started seeing the number of strangulations, hands on the throat, shot up because now it was being documented. And once we have the data to show this is not like a poor woman living in, you know, whatever, this is happening across the board to public figures, to the person who lives next door on your block. It's happening so much. I mean, I looked at the data. There were over 162,000 reports of domestic violence in 2022, and those are just the reported ones.
In
That doesn't
California.
even that doesn't even
And then,
capture all of the people who are living in silence, which is why your podcast is so critical. It's so important.
so Nancy, I'm
Um,
going to ask you, there were charges for strangulation and grave bodily injury in my case. And when in the ER, I mean, I can barely remember it, but it was, uh, you have no voice to speak for yourself. I had a concussion too. And it's just, you don't, when the staff is not educated or required by the law to document the physical stuff at the same time that a survivor can't vocalize for understandable reasons what just happened, to ask for it. Not, I mean, it's just impossible. Hopefully it won't be impossible someday, that there's enough education out there. um the the result is these unreported, these documented situations and cases. Now, um, the police in my situation did respond to a 911 call, or I'm not sure how it happened, but the people next door did call. And so the police came and then saw me and took me to the ER. And in the situations where that doesn't happen, again, this contact with medical staff is so key and important, that they are required, that they are trained, that they are asking the question. Um, Now, what would have been different in my situation, which was in early 2012, not the teens, had that law been in place? And what is your understanding of what happened?
it would have, well, you had other injuries. You had a lot of injuries, and had
Physical.
they had the training and the wherewithal to put a scope down your throat. And maybe it wasn't immediate, but to say, come back for your follow up. So let us look. And you remember Hillary Larkin, who is a physician assistant who's been like one of the
Unsung
leaders.
hero. Yes.
Yeah, she's amazing. And she's the
She
one
is
who
amazing.
she taught me so much, and that parlayed into speaking to other people and then helping with legislation. She taught me so much about strangulation because she was a warrior to get that kind of training for medical providers. So, but what would have happened
And
at that time?
and was she made aware? Like, I don't even know
She
anything.
was aware. In fact, I called her, and then she told me, call the doc. And I said, well, I tried to tell you. Um, but I believe that she made the phone call. I can't confirm that, but I believe she called down to the emergency department and said, don't forget to scope the throat, her throat. And so, uh, I think that what would have been different is,
I don't even know what they gathered. I do know that, um, you know, uh, I know what was written on the ER report. The I know that what injuries and all of that were written, but it's healing to hear what was happening outside with people. Um, it's healing
mhm.
to know.
And the truthfully, the bravery of you and other victim survivors of domestic violence to speak openly and publicly about your abuse has had an enormous impact on our legislators. And here's another area where that has become so critical, because they can pass a law, but if there are no resources to enforce the law, then it's a big who cares.
Hmm.
Um, but what happens is that when very, very courageous people open your lives up in a public way, that the legislators then pass the law and then the resources follow.
I see.
So in California, the forensic exam for a victim of sexual assault or domestic violence can never be billed to the victim. It
Mhm.
has to be paid by the state or by the local law enforcement, depending on which one it is. That's critical. And right now, the um, VOCA, the Victims of Crime Act, which is a national bill that was passed 30 years ago or something, that they provide money to all the states to address victims of crime,
Mhm.
and money for sexual assault exams, money for domestic violence exams, child abuse exams, those types of resources are VOCA got cut in half this year.
Mm.
And, this is our federal government, not
Wow.
giving the same amount of resources, even though with awareness, community awareness by people like you, Nadia, of speaking openly, it opens the door for other people who have been living in silence. And it
So
opens
what
the door for other
Thank you.
people to step forward. So we need the resources for
And
sure.
getting out of that cloud, that psychological thing, and is so important. And so, um, I wanna ask what would have been different in my case if that law had been in place? And then, um, what was your thoughts about when the case was taken away from you because they said that there was a conflict of interest? And so
Right.
I wanna ask those 2 difficult questions. What would have been different had the throat been scoped, and what exactly is that?
So there would have been if there, I mean, I'm not an expert in
Mhm.
strangulation like Gail Streck or Casey or other people, but from what I understand, that they can scope into the throat and see petechiae, which is broken blood vessels, basically. So they can see internal damage to the throat that is not going to be externally revealed yet. So if somebody puts their hands around the throat, the bruising a couple of days later will show up fingerprints. But what happens immediately is damage to the throat.
Within.
And, somebody can die from being choked like that.
Mhm. From
And
the
so that's the
inflammation.
first
Yeah.
thing, is that there would be documentation of that trauma. The second thing is that when the law changed, it actually recognized strangulation as a form of domestic violence. It was not recognized before. And it would think about it when somebody
It
went to
was
court.
not.
No, it was not even recognized. When somebody went to court to
So
talk
that's
about
why
it,
it said grave bodily injury on the charge?
well, unless you had evidence of
Strangulation.
it, and the grave
Strangulation.
bodily injury would,
My
you'd have
head.
to really capture what the trauma to the throat internal was.
I see.
But it also didn't even include any reference to strangulation. People didn't even think about this, like,
Okay.
grabbing you. So the law did a couple things. One is it forced the law to recognize strangulation as a form of domestic violence, that how common it is, because then now we're keeping statistics on strangulation if it's captured. And if you ask someone, if you ask someone, were you strangled? They're going to say no. Did he put his hands on your throat? Yes. So we had to educate people about
Yeah.
what strangulation really is. And then lastly is that it does enhance the sentence. And so much was missed, so much great bodily injury was missed because nobody was thinking about strangulation. And that's where in Alameda County, at least, Hillary Larkin was the pioneer in saying, I'm going to start scoping people's throat to see if there's any trauma there. So that's what would be
It's
different.
so mind-boggling that with the evidence in the ER and with the photos after, it's just so mind-boggling that the Attorney General's office didn't follow through with prosecution other than judgment of my responses to the public media and the shaming and the psychological stuff. And I it obviously still comes up in a very painful way. Um, and I always asked the question, like, how? How could that have happened? And I know that had it remained in your hands, that the physical evidence, the photos, that it would have spoke for itself. And if I had the guts to stand up, if I had the wherewithal, see, I'm blaming myself to speak my truth about all the psychological things that had happened before and my behavior, and it's just impossible at that point. So I want to thank you for using that as at least I know that it resulted in change and positive change for others. Um, so they don't have to go through the same thing that
Mhm.
I went through. It's a different story because of who I was married to and um, the positions that he had and then that I had. But the personal story, the pain, the abuse, so in every way, psychological, physical, emotional, is the same. And when you're not believed, um, there's help out there for you. You are not alone. And I believe you. And start within yourself to connect to your truth. And slowly, slowly, you will see the light and hope. And so please don't give up. You are not
So,
alone.
so one of the things that your situation, your story, and others who have found the courage to speak out more, more and more, is that it shows that this is a unique crime. It's unique to, it's not like being robbed where somebody comes and steals something from you and there's violence. I mean, it's the violence for sure, but this is interpersonal violence. And so my feeling, in which I helped, well, or did, when I was a supervising DA in the office before I became the chief assistant or the DA, that I really advocated for having a special unit with specially trained prosecutors and investigators so that we knew how to present a case in court, because it would be
Mm,
easy for a jury to get distracted away from the crime because of the person, especially a person of notoriety and leadership that you were, and Bill was. It would have been easy for a jury to be distracted, but trained prosecutors know how to present this kind of evidence so that juries don't go, oh, this is just a fight between a husband and wife, girlfriend, boyfriend,
I
whatever.
see.
They
Yeah.
minimize it. So specialized unit, and for sure specialized training. And we're losing some of that now,
Mm,
and a lot of it is driven by resources. I understand that. I don't agree with it. I think that if there are going to be resources, put them at a place where it affects people at the core of their existence. And in
yes.
domestic violence, it isn't just the victim, although that's the main, but children
Children.
who are raised by someone
Right.
who's experiencing trauma that doesn't have an outlet for that, addressing that trauma.
The ability to describe and lay out and present a very painful human experience in another is the skill that you're advocating for, and that you see is dwindling in the county.
Well, and the other part is that we also passed a law that said that perpetrators, convicted perpetrators, have to go to 52-week batters intervention program.
Mhm.
And I mean, it wasn't a heavy lift. It was an hour a week for 52 weeks, hoping that they would gain some insight and some other things. It was rarely enforced. And there
Mm.
was someone in the probation department who was a bulldog about this. And I don't know if it's because she had her own experiences. It could have been. But she would sit outside and take roll of who was going into the class to make sure they went in. And what we saw was, she brought it to me, and we saw that these men were going in, they were paying $100 or whatever the cost was, and walking out the door
Oh
5 minutes
my
later.
gosh.
So we went to the court.
Wasted
I went to the court
resources.
and
Right.
said, I want to prosecute these providers for fraud,
Good
because
for
they're
you.
telling you that this person is going to treatment, but they're not. They're just collecting the money. Two of the programs
Gosh.
disappeared overnight. They just left. We don't even know where they went. The court would not take action against the batterer for
Fraud.
engaging in this fraud. It just wasn't a priority for them. And if we can't
Have
insist,
accountability. Right.
that's right. And
With the
training.
resources we have, what's happening? There
And some of
must
these
be
people,
accountability.
that's right.
This
And
is
some of these
supposed to
men,
be changing things and reducing numbers and changing
that's
things
right.
for the better. There has to be accountability. How
And
frustrating.
some of these men probably grew up in a domestic violence home, and
Right.
their manifestation is because of that.
Ex right.
They could be helped too, but there was a push at one
To
point.
see that they learned this and to start to heal the little boy within them. It's all
That's right.
circular.
That's why that you just hit the nail on the head. That's why the response to domestic violence is so critical,
Mhm.
because without that response and without voices like yours, it's generational, and it'll just keep going. Because how are we going, at least with the law, we can say, if it is enforced, you have to go to counseling to stop this behavior. And for the victim survivor, that's why family justice centers exist. what we were doing was I calculated it. We
Mhm.
For a victim of domestic violence in Alameda County, before we got the grant to open our Family Justice Center, that victim would have to go to 25 different locations to access all the services that we were offering. The
Mhm.
truth is, if it's more than one, forget it.
Right.
They're in trauma
With children in tow,
with children.
especially.
Now I'm
Right,
going to run all over town trying to
right.
find, okay. So the Family Justice Center was the genius invention
And the
of Casey Gwinn,
numbers of the efficiency, the numbers were so spoke for it. The cost of an arrest, of an investigation was maximized if somebody is getting help and changing their lives for the better and their children's lives.
for sure.
And that's faltering right now? Yes.
Well, I'm, I haven't been in the courtroom around this, but I've been in Sacramento and the advisory group, and we're actually at our advisory group is that we've spent the last year really trying to um, modernize, if you will, the process. So it's how are the shelters and the domestic violence providers identifying human beings and just even identifying their nationality or their identity is something that we're paying a lot of attention to. We had a 2-day strategic planning meeting, which is amazing for for an advisory group. Um, I paid for it, meaning from our budget, because it was important for us to have the leadership to develop our leadership in how we're going to advise the state to address domestic violence in today's time.
Mhm.
Very successful. I mean, I have to say, Cal OES, the Office of Emergency Services, continues to put resources into violence against women programs and violence against people programs with involving children, domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, all of those things. And listen, we haven't even talked about stalking in domestic violence cases, which
Oh,
is
we're
another
gonna I hope to
terrorizing.
interview you. Hold Nancy O'Malley, thank you so much for your leadership. I am going to ask if we could please come back and have another conversation about, um, accountability of the abusers and all the legislation that was passed to create programs for prevention and and, requiring the batters programs and the accountability of programs and them not committing fraud and wasted funds is of such importance as you explained. And then also a conversation about stalking and all your knowledge of that would be so, so helpful. Um, the overall point and message here is there will be the he said, she said stories, and there will be also the survivor's experience that is layered and then the judgment of the survivor's responses. But ultimately, it is the physical evidence that is so powerful in bringing out the truth of what happened, which is the truth of the matter. So, Nancy, are there any other things that you would like to say and point out or cover in our future discussions?
One of the unique perspectives of recognizing strangulation, or they say strangulation or suffocation,
Okay,
is that it doesn't require there to be substantial injury. It's not like a great bodily injury enhancement to a charge. That's the first thing, is that just the act itself is
I see.
is recognized. The other thing I'll just say is that it takes a huge amount of courage, tremendous amount of courage, for domestic violence to be reported. I mean, for many, that the perpetrator is the provider of the resources to the family, or there's a complicated dynamic between them and children, and but so it doesn't have to be the end of relationship. It doesn't have to be like the worst thing that ever happened, getting help through the court system can stop domestic violence. And as importantly, to show children that this is not a way of life and that they do not have to grow up falling in the same pathway as a victim or a perpetrator. So just getting help through family justice centers, there are shelters and providers in every county in California, every county. And they're funded by the California Office of Emergency Services. So, reaching out and getting help is takes bravery, it takes courage, but I promise that it is a benefit that is provided to victims at no cost to them, to be able to have a life that is free of violence, have their children grow up in a home that's free of violence. And Nadia, the
And
last thing I'll say about you is
once you
your
have the courage, there's a plethora of resources out there. And if you're feeling just stuck in that bubble like I was, and here I had helped to deliver these services and I couldn't even see it myself or didn't have the ability to reach out for help. It starts with sobriety and a mental stability that you can find within yourself. And trust me, the warmth and the support that you will receive after just that, following that 1 ounce of hope, that road to your truth, it's so worth it. And anyone out there that is in the middle of barely recognizing the situation they're in, it's okay it took that long. It's okay, but now it's time. It's time to reach out for help.
and you are the model of recovery and resilience, and your courage in sharing your story and digging deep in a pretty, I mean, you've shared how deep you've had to go to reveal your truth, and that is inspiring for other people. It makes it safe for other people to do the same. So thank you for everything that you have done and are doing, continuing to do.
I would not be alive today without having had our roads cross. And just thank you so much, Nancy O'Malley, for everything. Thank you so much.
And I say thank you right back to you.
You are not alone. If you are dealing with shame and trauma, please reach out to me through my website, nadia-davis.com. You can get a free Ban Shame tip sheet and find out about upcoming events. I'd love it if you picked up my book, Home is Within You, wherever books are sold. If you like this podcast, please tell a friend, leave a review, and make sure to follow me on Apple, Google, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Sending warm hugs.